I'm Emily Beament. I'm the Environment Correspondent at the Press Association, which is the UK's national news agency. The conference was a meeting of more than 190 countries from around the world under the UN, and the point of it was to try and come up with a new global agreement on tackling climate change and cutting greenhouse gas emissions. After 2 weeks of talks, there was an accord reached. It was called the Copenhagen Accord, and it was an agreement by countries which produce about 80% of the world's emissions to cut their emissions in a bid to try and keep temperature rises to not more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. But the accord was seen in many quarters as a failure because it wasn't legally binding and it wasn't fully adopted by the UN. The main countries that were involved in the accord were the biggest polluters, so that's the US, China, countries like Brazil and Indonesia, which obviously contribute through deforestation to the emissions that go out into the atmosphere, the European Union and a number of other developed countries all signed up to the accord to cut their emissions. Yes, and one of the ironic things about climate change is that the countries that have done least to cause the problems, we're talking about countries in Africa, the small island states like the Maldives, are those countries who are likely to be most badly hit by its effects. So that industrial countries like the UK, like the US, like Europe, have probably got the money to adapt to some of the worst impacts, and also aren't in the places that are going to be most strongly hit. So, for example, the low-lying states who have very, very small emissions are going to be hit by sea level rises. Africa, which again has very low emissions, is likely to be hit by droughts and changes to weather patterns and other problems like that. The Accord sets out that we want to keep temperature rises to no more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And calculations have been done about how we would get there by cutting emissions. And at the moment, the kind of ranges that countries have put forward aren't going to get us to 2 degrees C. So at the moment, there's a feeling that we need to do more, but it's up to individual countries to come forward and say that they're going to do more. And a lot of countries have put forward a range. So in Europe, we've said 20 to 30% cuts by 2020. And what is needed is for all of the countries that have done that to go to the highest end of their range, and then probably do more than that in order to get to 2 degrees C. Because the Copenhagen Accord is not legally binding, there are no penalties for any country that doesn't meet its target. And this is one of the problems of the Accord, and it's also one of the reasons why a lot of developing countries were very keen to stick with the old Kyoto Protocol, even though it didn't include the United States, because under Kyoto, which is a legally binding deal, there would be penalties for countries that don't meet their targets. Under the existing UN agreement on climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, rich countries can pay poorer nations to develop clean technology, such as putting in a wind farm instead of a coal-fired power station. And then the rich country gets credit for that it can offset against its own emissions reductions targets. The main green technologies that are going to help combat climate change are green sources of energy. So we're talking solar power, we're talking hydroelectricity, so building dams to use the power of water to create electricity, wind farms in places like the UK where it's extremely windy. There are technologies that they're trying to develop, such as technology to capture the carbon from fossil fuel powered stations before it gets into the atmosphere and then bury it deep underground. And there's a very controversial area which is geoengineering, which is really major scale projects to try and prevent the planet warming. And these include things like making fake clouds in the sky to stop the sun coming through as strongly, putting mirrors up in the sky, giant mirrors to reflect the sunlight, and what other ones are there? Even massive scale tree planting projects would count as geoengineering. But the problem with them is that they're completely untested. We don't know whether it's going to work at all. And there are also lots of impacts of climate change that aren't about just the temperatures warming. And the more carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere, the more acidic the oceans become, and that can have all sorts of problems that geoengineering wouldn't help tackle.